Welcome back to Wilmington's Morning News. It's great to have you here. You can always text or call, get your comments in on the air this morning at 910-763-4000. That's 910-763-4000. Well, as we have seen over the last couple of years, an increasing concern, and rightfully so, by the American public that the federal government continues to infringe upon First Amendment rights. And we saw this really at the peak during the COVID-19 pandemic when folks' social media profiles were blasted away and completely deleted when they questioned things like mask mandates or other sorts of things that were brought forward through the CDC and other entities within the federal government. Well, there's been an interesting decision from the U.S. Court of Appeals in the Fifth Circuit. To give us some more information on that this morning, I'd like to welcome to our airwaves James Czerniawski. He is a senior tech and innovation policy analyst at Americans for Prosperity. He's also representative of Young Voices. James, good morning to you. Tell us a little bit about this decision from the U.S. Court of Appeals. What exactly is going on?
Yeah, that's a great question. So basically, the Fifth Circuit came out with a decision last week that was concerning an injunction that had been placed on broad swaths of the Biden administration from being able to communicate with social media companies because the claim was that they had violated the First Amendment in pressuring these companies to take down certain pieces of content like COVID misinformation, like election misinformation and things of that nature. The Fifth Circuit went and scaled back some of the application of who would be covered underneath the injunction, but did find that the FBI, the Center for Disease and Controls, and the Biden administration Surgeon General had likely violated the First Amendment, and that injunction still applies to them. So that's really the nexus of this case, is trying to go and strike a balance between what is permissible for the government to do when it comes to the communications it has with companies that it can obviously exert control over. So this is a fascinating case when we're talking about free speech. It's also a fascinating case when we're talking about what is the role and scope of government that can be applied here. So it was a pretty big decision, and the Solicitor General actually of the United States already put in an emergency injunction request to go and stay that decision for the time being. And the Supreme Court now has it under review for shadow docket between now and September 20th for parties to go and file briefs in that case.
I think there's often a misconception with the First Amendment. I think a lot of folks throw it out, like, I can say whatever I want. I have the First Amendment right to do so. And while there might be some truth to that, when you realistically look at what the First Amendment is, at least as I understand it, James, it specifically deals with this situation right here. When the federal government is overstepping its bounds and trying to censor speech and limit speech of the population. Is that what you understand as well?
Yeah, so basically what this theory is working under here is what would be called the state action doctrine. So the government, the First Amendment applies to the government. It does not apply to private companies like the social media platforms themselves. But if the federal government were going and pressuring these companies to take action on certain types of content, then you would argue that these companies are no longer acting in their own individual capacities where the First Amendment would not apply, but rather under duress or coercion. And that means that the state is actually going and deputizing them to be censors, and that is where they would be considered a state actor, and you could go and hold the government accountable for something like that. So that's a little bit of the nuance there that kind of kicks in. It's really typically been very hard to go and prove something like that, which is why you saw the Fifth Circuit kind of claw back the breadth of the injunction in terms of who it would apply to, and really focus down on the main people who were being egregiously bad with their behavior here. So it is a very fascinating case, and I think that there will be plenty to learn from here.
Does any of this have to do with Matt Taibbi and the infamous Twitter files in which he leaked didn't leak, he published, direct screenshots and information of individuals within the Biden administration having conversation with former heads of Twitter, Jack Dorsey, and some of the folks under him? Is that in any of this at all?
No, actually, that was something that was separate. That was just additionally egregious behavior, and also Representative Jim Jordan has done similar efforts leading the House Judiciary Committee, where he's been getting a lot of emails voluntarily from the companies themselves during that time frame from the companies. But actually, a lot of the emails and evidence that was introduced in this case was drawn because the attorney generals were able to go and get to discovery where they could go and get these kind of emails produced from the federal government. So really, that's just all in addition to whatever the government found when they were suing the Biden administration for the attorneys general, which really it goes to back to your point, right, where it's a fine line. Again, it's one thing if you're trying to go and advocate for your position as the government for how you look at a particular issue, or wanting to go and have a company take action on clearly illegal material, like let's say CSAM, versus going and targeting a parody account that's making fun of Fauci or an account that has memes about Joe Biden or something. That's obviously radically different kind of behavior. And I think that that's really what's at the heart of this case here, is trying to do a better job of what is identifying what is that permissible communication that the government should be having, if any, with these kinds of companies.
Yeah, it's amazing, this term. Fortunately, we don't hear it as much anymore, but it was very prevalent during parts of 2020 and 2021, James. Oh, that's COVID misinformation, right? That was the key. That was the tag term. And even to this day, if you go on YouTube and watch some videos, you'll still see a big banner at the bottom of the video that this is not official health news, and verify, check with the CDC or whatnot. I can't believe, as we sit back from this now, in some cases a year or two later, the egregious actions that the federal government took to shut people down for asking a basic question. Does a simple cloth mask with its particulate levels, does that stop the spread of something like COVID-19? I can't believe we're even having this conversation. It's insane to me.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think the biggest problem that comes with the notion of misinformation is that it's a highly subjective term. If you were to go and say what was misinformation at the start of the pandemic versus even 1 year later versus 2 years later versus 3 years later, obviously our understanding is radically different. And there are certain members of Congress that had proposals that were brought forth during that period of time that would have amended Section 230 to go and hold these companies liable for what was quote unquote medical misinformation. So that would have resulted in more takedown of this kind of speech too. So really, it's a pretty alarming situation when you have members of Congress or the government that are trying to really control how information is disseminated online through these proposals or through veiled threats in committee hearings or other kinds of actions. So, which is things that even the original injunction highlighted, was how you had members of Congress in hearings that were going and threatening companies with removing or modifying that liability shield that they have underneath Section 230 and the kind of credible threat that represents to them. So again, I think that it's a very concerning conversation. It's something that's very fascinating in terms of the cases. Now that it's in front of the Supreme Court for review, to see about that stay for the time being. It's something that I think will be very fascinating and will lead to a very interesting year up at SCOTUS.
James Czerniawski joins us this morning. He is over at Americans for Prosperity. He's also a representative of Young Voices, joins us here this morning. You've got in here something about Section 702. What exactly is that, and how does that play into this further discussion?
Yeah, so Section 7.2 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act is a power that is afforded to the surveillance community to engage in collection of data on non-U.S. persons as a part of their, national security responsibilities that they're trying to carry out here. Now, the problem that happens with that is that the internet is a borderless medium, and data is kind of, spread throughout the entire globe. And what happens when they go and they do that collection on non-U.S. persons is that more often than not, they also do what would be quote-unquote incidental collection of Americans' data in the process of that. And then they search through all that data, including the Americans' data, and that's a violation of their Fourth Amendment rights. And it's been abused and really just horrendous behavior from our intelligence community repeatedly over the past several years. It's been going on for a long time now. And this authority is set to expire at the end of the year. So there's a lot of people that are actually trying to go and work right now to get some much needed reforms to that. So that way people's rights are being respected and we don't have the intelligence community spying on Americans.
Well, and I think that's the big concern, and that's, I think, what folks are finding themselves ever more cautious of. Obviously, James, this stuff is very complicated, right? There's a lot of moving parts here, and it's a very, very complex scenario. But I mean, when you boil it down and make it as simple as possible, you've seemingly got the federal government believing that they're in a position where they can control what the public says, not only what they can say, but more importantly, what they can see and what kind of conversations they can have. And that should be a real eye opener to everybody.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And again, like I said, this is an authority that is meant to help, with our intelligence community deal with non-U.S. persons that are, that they might think are credible threats to U.S. national security. And, at some way through the process, there's a scope creep that happens here. And all of a sudden we find out that, oh, they were using this authority to go and spy on January 6th protesters. Oh, they were using this authority to go and spy on Black Lives Matter protesters. Oh, they were using this authority to go and spy on a sitting congressman. Oh, they were using this to go and target political donors. So it's a really alarming situation when you have an authority that was clearly meant for non-U.S. persons and a different kind of functionality getting abused and really misused so egregiously, so many times repeatedly here. And really there's an opportunity that Congress has to try to right some of these wrongs by having much needed reforms in the proposal to go and reauthorize Section 702 later this year.
I want to read you a quote from the White House in response to this and get your reaction. Our consistent view, this is from the White House, our consistent view remains that social media platforms have a critical responsibility to take account of the effects their platform are having on the American people, but make independent choices about the information they present. That's a very different strategy than they were taking when they were emailing Jack Dorsey, Mark Zuckerberg, and the head of some of these companies and telling them to remove specific accounts and specific conversations from their platforms.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, that's very legal speak to go and try to cover themselves from any potential further scrutiny. Because at the end of the day, if it is clear that the company is the one that's making the decision here, that then there is no First Amendment violation consideration, legally speaking. So that's not a surprise that the Biden administration framed it this way. But once again, like I'd say, it's a not so subtle threat in many ways to these companies to go and police this kind of content in one way or another, because, make no mistake, there are other legislative proposals that are out there that would certainly harm these companies' business models in many ways. So, again, I just think that it's more of the same from this administration. They're wielding their power to let you know what they're thinking without going and, demanding that you do something. But if you were to happen to do something, well, then that's mighty fine. So, again, I think that's, unfortunate that our government officials feel the need to go and pressure these companies one way or another. And, we need to get back to a spot where, that's not happening, because that's better for the American people when we're in that kind of a position.
Yeah, and I think many folks would argue that that's not the role. That's undoubtedly not the role of government in any way, shape, or form. James Czerniawski joins us here this morning. James, final question for you. We're going to watch this obviously play out. Who knows how long it's going to take. But I still have no faith that the federal government, depending on who's in charge, is not going to have these back channel conversations. They got caught doing it this time. They got caught with their hand in the cookie jar. I guess they'll make sure that next time when they do it, it's more descriptive and they don't get caught, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's always going to be a constant battle, which is why, there are definitely some calls for proposals that would go and require that these government officials that are interacting with these social media platforms have some level of transparency in terms of documenting when they are going and communicating with them surrounding content and what they're asking them to do exactly, things of that nature. So I think if you have some level of transparency about what the government's actions are doing in this space, it might make them a little less inclined to go and do it as frequently, and at least try to focus it more on the stuff that is perfectly permissible in their current role. So we could only hope that we can get something like that on the books here, but it is Congress and things do slow there. So that's something that we'll just have to continue to monitor and see how it plays out.
Tell us what you do over at AFP.
Yeah, I am the senior policy analyst there that covers technology and innovation issues. So I look at Section 230, I look at antitrust. Increasingly, I'm looking at artificial intelligence. Anything that touches tech, I'm the guy that's covering it. So it's a lot of fun. You get to have a lot of great conversations with people like yourself and others in the state houses and on the federal level. So it's really it's a fun place to be, and I love having that opportunity to do this kind of work.
Where do folks find out more information about what you're doing?
Yeah, so you guys can go and follow me on X, formerly known as Twitter, at JamesCZ19, and you'll you will go and hear all my latest musings on tech policy over there.
James, thank you so much for the time this morning. Greatly appreciated. Let's catch up in the next couple weeks. I'm curious your thoughts on this AI summit that took place this week.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely appreciate your time. James Czerniawski joining us here this morning talking about some of the ongoings at the federal level with, the government deciding that, hey, we're going to contact these big tech companies and tell them, make sure you delete these accounts, remove these kinds of content. We don't want that stuff getting out to the American people. Pretty concerning stuff for sure.